Okay, very good. All right. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvabhutaguhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarva Vide Namaha. Good. Nice to see you all this morning. Welcome also to the many students attending this class online. In this chapter 18, we saw one of the longest by far chapter of the text, Upadesha Sahasri. And I said arguably the most important, and one reason it's both long and important is Shankara takes up many opposing points of view and considers them very deeply. And after a thorough examination of those opposing points of view, he negates them. And we've talked before about the tradition of Purva Paksha and Siddhanta. Purva Paksha is the opponent's point of view intentionally introduced for the sake of discussion. In English, we say devil's advocate position, which is a correct way of understanding it, which is followed, of course, by the response. This response is called Siddhanta. Siddhanta is our established point of view. So in a simple text, Purva Paksha will be one verse, and the Siddhanta might be one or more verses. In a sophisticated text, like the one we're studying, the Purva Paksha can go on for many verses, and the response can be many verses. Of course, that leads to a little concern. If you're reading the opposing point of view for many verses, you might get convinced. It happens. So, in today's class, before we're getting into such a discussion, but a really, really important topic. I think you're going to find this topic so revealing and give you tremendous insight into what these teachings are and how they work. In order to even get started, we need to get the big picture. We need to understand what is the Purva Paksha's point of view, what is the Siddhanta's point of view, and get the big picture before, otherwise we'll get lost in the verses. So I am going to go to the board, and let's see, I need to turn this off and go to that. All right. And the name of the opposing point of view, let's see if I can get this to go. This is a belt clip. As a standard joke, my gosh, I've used that so many times. In fact, about 30 years ago, I went, when Bell Labs was still here, I think I went there, and that was my, everyone's wearing their coats and ties, and you like that joke. Okay. So let's get started here. The name of the opposing point of view is let me spell it correctly. Jnana Vada. Vada is a doctrine, and prasankhya literally means repetition. And you'll get a lot more insight as we go along. But in brief, it's like repeating aham brahmasmi, aham brahmasmi, aham brahmasmi, aham brahmasmi, which may sound very profound, but it's a doctrine with huge defects, as we'll see going along. This prasankhya vada was taught by, I can't even read that. Mandana Mishra, who was a contemporary of Shankaracharya. Mandana Mishra was famous for a text, is famous for a text known as Brahma Siddhi, very important comprehensive text on Advaita Vedanta that we don't study. We don't study because it is quite to the contrary of what Shankaracharya taught. By studying Brahma Siddhi, it's like studying the Purva Paksha. The whole text is filled with perspectives that are contrary to Shankara. So we don't study it because it can cause great confusion. But here, Shankaracharya very deliberately introduces one of the major teachings of Mandana Mishra. Don't think we're ignoring it. So Shankara here is introducing and developing a major teaching of Mandana Mishra for the sake of addressing it and dismissing it. There's a traditional story, true or not, I have no idea, that Shankara and Mandana Mishra had a debate long ago. And not surprisingly, Mandana Mishra lost the debate, and he touches Shankara's feet and says, I want to become your disciple. And Mandana Mishra is then ordained as Sureshwaracharya. If that story is true or not, I have no idea, but it's definitely traditional Vedantins will hold that story true. It doesn't make any difference whether it's true or not. What is important is to understand Mandana Mishra's prasankhya vada. And it has a lot to do with our understanding of, make sure this is all on the board, our understanding of the purpose of Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana. Let me make sure that's all on the board, yes. They both understand the function of these three. These are, as we've described, the three main practices of Advaita Vedanta. If you asked why isn't bhakti and dhyana and karma yoga included, that's all up here. That's all preparatory. Meaning, the first practice, Shravana, presumes you've already done all those preparatory practices. If you have not, you are not an adhikari. You are not a prepared student for Shravana. So we'll see how Shankara and Mandana Mishra handle those very differently. So let's put Shankara here and Mandana Mishra. So according to Shankara, having done all the preparatory steps, having studied all the scriptures, so the first part of Shravana is the scriptural study under the guidance of the Guru, which leads you, the technical way of describing it is for the Mahavakya Tattvamasi, there's a long inquiry into the nature of Tvam, who are you, and there's a long inquiry into Tat, everything else. And then finally, the Mahavakya, and I'm going to abbreviate that, The Mahavakya, which is, let me make sure this all lines up. This is going to be a complicated but important chart by the time we're done. So according to Shankara, when you are fully prepared and when you have undergone a proper study of Advaita Vedanta under the guidance of a guru. Remember, whenever I say study of Vedanta, we have to put that word study in quotation marks. We've had this discussion several times before, because the subject matter is not Advaita Vedanta. The subject matter is you, your true nature, and the nature of Brahman. So we could say then that Vedanta, properly used by you with the help of the teacher, leads you on a process of self-inquiry that culminates in your ability to recognize when the Mahavakya says when the Mahavakya says Tat-tvamasi, or when the Mahavakya says Aham Brahmasmi, you get it in a non-conceptual way. It's actually a discovery of a truth of who you are. I indeed am that Brahman. I am that. I always have been that. And that is what Shankara will then call jnana, knowledge. Now, something we've discussed many times is there's a requirement after making this initial discovery of your true nature, there's a requirement for manana and nididhyasana because this knowledge that you get, this immediate discovery of what you get, doesn't immediately erase all the problems of your brain and mind. We've had this discussion fairly recently, and that is our minds are biological. Our minds are based on our brains, which are biological computers, and things don't change instantly in your brain. Modern neuroscience, I don't like that expression. Modern neuroscience. Is there such a thing as ancient neuroscience? I catch myself on this silly stuff every now and then. Neuroscience has shown us very clearly that learning is a process of rewiring your brain. Yeah. The concentration of neurotransmitters at the synapses in your brain change. And that literally doesn't rewire your brain, it changes how the neurons interact. Do you think that will, when you get enlightened, does all of that change in an instant? That's a completely unrealistic expectation. Therefore, after this initial discovery, there are two problems that will remain. One problem is doubts, and the other problem is habitual identification with your body and mind. We've spoken about that before, and we've called it dehatma buddhi. Dehatma buddhi means a buddhi, this habitual identification that you, your true self, is deha, both stula and sukshma. So habitual identification with your body and mind. Which means this knowledge that you get as a result of Shravana, it is knowledge. It is complete, immediate discovery of your true nature, but we've got these problems. These problems in Sanskrit are called pratibandhas. So therefore, we call this knowledge, I hope this is going to fit. And I'm in trouble. So, we'll manage. So we call this knowledge Sa, and I'm sorry for writing so small, but I'm running out of room. Sa prati bandhika jnana. Sa pratibandhika jnana, knowledge which is obstructed, and obstructed by what? Doubts and dehatma buddhi, habitual identification. These doubts and dehatma buddhi are addressed by manana and nididhyasana. I don't need to explain this further. We've discussed this at great length in our other classes. So then the question becomes, how does Mandana's vision, how does Mandana's teaching differ so significantly? This seems pretty straightforward. Of course, we've studied this many times. So you'll be surprised, I think, at how Mandana takes it very differently. So he says that, like Shankara, the Mahavakya leads to knowledge, but he says it's not sapratibandhika jnanam, it is paroksha jnanam. This is an important word. Paroksha means indirect knowledge. So the Mahavakya is words, right? Statement. You are that. Generally, words give indirect knowledge. For example, if I use words to describe Gangotri, this is my favorite example, Gangotri, high in the Himalayas, where the Ganga has its origins, it's called Bhagirathi River up there. At the foot of the town of Gangotri, there's a beautiful waterfall, sandstone waterfall. A few of you may have seen it. Presuming you haven't seen it, I've just described a waterfall. I've used words to give you knowledge of a waterfall that exists at the foot of Gangotri. Tell me, is that direct knowledge or indirect knowledge? Right? That's a good example of paroksha jnana. It is indirect knowledge. Unless you go there and see it for yourself, then you'll have direct knowledge. But based on my words, you get indirect knowledge. And the whole Vedas are made of words. So when the Vedas teach you that you do these rituals, you go to heaven, your knowledge of heaven is direct or indirect? Indirect. In general, words give, but we'll see an exception later. In general, words give indirect knowledge, paroksha jnanam. So notice, both traditions recognize the fact that in the practice of Shravana, when you make that initial discovery of your true self, you're not done. So according to Shankara, you have sapratibandhika jnanam, you have doubts and dehatma buddhi that have to be removed through manana and nididhyasana. And according to Mandana Mishra, you're not done because you don't have direct knowledge yet. So what do you have to do? Am I missing anything here? No. So what do you have to do to get direct knowledge? Well, they're not so different in their approaches. So he says, well, you have to get rid of your doubts. So if I say there is a, write this, you can see the similarity here. If I say that there's a waterfall at the base of Gangotri, is Swamiji pulling our leg? What a funny English expression. What does that mean, pulling you? Who knows? Anyway, is Swamiji really, suppose you don't trust me? You may have some doubts, possible. So if there are any doubts, certainly after getting this Mahavakya that says you are Brahman, if you don't have doubts, you haven't been listening. Or better yet, if you don't have doubts, you haven't been doing self-inquiry. Some people just believe, yes, I believe I am Brahman. This is not belief. So if you believe you're Brahman, you don't know you are Brahman. So if you have doubts, it means it's not merely a belief. You should have doubts, and those doubts are addressed. And it's normal to have dehatma buddhi. So in the same way, Mandana Mishra says that you get paroksha jnana, and then next step, you have to remove those doubts. And then the final step is where the huge difference takes place. And that is his conception, Mandana Mishra's conception of dehatma buddhi, of nididhyasana. His conception is you should perform prasankhya, repetition. Aham brahmasmi, aham brahmasmi. So far you have indirect knowledge, like knowledge of the waterfall. That indirect knowledge has been freed from doubts, but it's still indirect. So you have to convert that indirect knowledge into direct knowledge. How do you do that? Prasankhya, aham brahmasmi, aham brahmasmi, aham brahmasmi. So this practice of prasankhya is to convert paroksha jnana into aparoksha jnana. Pardon my abbreviations, but you get what I'm saying. So, in some ways, they're quite similar, but this is huge when you think about it. The fact that Shankara says that when you are, let me illustrate the huge gap. These are not as similar as they may look, even though they follow the same pattern. Here's how they are so incredibly different. According to Shankara, when you are a prepared student, adhikari, and when you do shravana properly means you use the teachings with the teacher's guidance to undergo a process of atma-vichara, self-inquiry. That guided process of self-inquiry is what we really mean by shravana. I know it gets translated as listening, but that is such an inadequate translation. Shravana then is a practice when a prepared, notice all these requirements, when a fully prepared student undergoes a process of self-inquiry guided by the scripture as unfolded by the teacher, then and only then the Mahavakya can lead to jnana. What kind of jnana? Aparoksha jnana, direct knowledge. You discover yourself. Is that indirect? If your self-inquiry leads you to recognize, hey, that's true about me. That's direct knowledge, right? Aparoksha jnanam. Of course, we admit that it is sapratibandhika. We admit there can be doubts and habitual identification, but clearly it is direct knowledge. It is an immediate personal discovery of who you always have been. That is absolutely direct knowledge, aparoksha jnanam. And how different it is then when Mandana Mishra dumbs, to use a modern expression, he dumbs down shravana. And he says, shravana merely gives you indirect knowledge, which means you have lots more work to do. And here's another way of recognizing how different these perspectives are. When you get this sapratibandhika jnanam, I'll ask you a trick question. When you get this sapratibandhika jnanam, are you enlightened or not? That's a really complicated, tricky question. Because yes and no. Yes, you've discovered your true nature. But you've got all this stuff in the way, so you can't really enjoy. You lack the benefits of enlightenment. You have enlightenment without the perks. How's that? But technically you're enlightened if we define enlightenment as one who knows one's true self. That's here. So you know your true self, but initially it doesn't lead to any benefits at all in your life. Gradually, as you remove these doubts, and especially as you remove this dehatma buddhi, then the fruits of the enlightenment come. So they make a distinction in the technical, in the commentaries. The terms they would say is Shravana gives you jnana, aparoksha jnana, direct knowledge, but it doesn't give you jnana phala. Notice that expression, jnana phala, the fruits of that knowledge. And you get jnana without jnana phala because that knowledge is obstructed, sapratibandhika. It's obstructed by doubts and habitual identification. When you remove those obstacles, then you not only have aparoksha jnana, but you also have the jnana phala. This is the way it's explained in commentaries. Notice how different it is here. In Mandana Mishra's view, when you practice Shravana, by the way, he also insists that you have to be a prepared student. So you are a prepared student, practicing Shravana under the guidance, using the scriptures under the guidance of a teacher. But according to Mandana Mishra, it does not lead to a personal discovery of your true nature. What happened to atma-vichara? What happened to self? You can see how huge the difference is. It's like he doesn't even envision Vedanta as a process of self-inquiry. It's hard to imagine how a process of self-inquiry can lead to indirect knowledge. He takes a very scholarly point of view, and this really is a more the perspective, less the perspective of a yogi or practitioner, more the perspective of a scholar. So from a more scholarly perspective, this practice of Shravana does not give direct knowledge, but merely gives paroksha jnanam, indirect knowledge, which later has to be converted into direct knowledge. And according to Mandana Mishra, how do you convert paroksha jnana into aparoksha jnana? Manana, and especially, I don't know if he uses the word nididhyasana or not, but he certainly uses the word prasankhya, repetition. So aham brahmasmi, which somehow, notice, somehow converts a paroksha jnana, indirect knowledge, into aparoksha jnana. How? We're going to examine that. And there's some, you can anticipate that we'll find some problems in trying to say, how does that happen? How does that work exactly? So this is what we are about to begin. Yeah, we'll see a few verses, at least the first couple of verses today. Important to get the big picture before we go on. I don't usually stop for questions in this class, but I think because of the nature of this topic, this would be a good point for me to, I think I can sit down and go back to here. Do you have any comments very specifically on what's here? By the way, anticipate that we're going to be explaining all of this. So actually, maybe I should change my mind about questions. Because this is the introduction. All of this is going to be examined in great depth. I apologize. I think that was not a very good move on my part. So let's leave questions aside, and by the way, why should I answer your questions? Shankara is ready to answer your questions. So that's a good way to conclude our introduction and resume our text. So first comes the Purva Paksha, goes on for a number of verses. By the way, remember this is an abbreviated version. So we have 4 verses of Purva Paksha. Shankara has about 10. So, and that's just Purva Paksha. Okay, let's begin. Sareva tvamasi tyukte, sareva tvamasi tyukte, nanatmano, natmano muktatam sthiram, natmano muktatam sthiram, prapadyate prasanchaksham, prapadyate prasanchaksham, ato yuktyanuchintayet, ato yuktyanuchintayet. Sareva tvam asi. Sareva or tat eva tvam asi, or sat also means Brahman. So you are Brahman, you are that. This is Mahavakya. Sareva tvam, you are that reality, is how Shankara chooses here to bring out Mahavakya. By the way, there are not 4 Mahavakyas. Everyone says, 4 Mahavakyas. There are hundreds. Any statement that reveals the identity of your true nature with Brahman, the underlying reality because of which the world exists, any statement in any scripture that reveals that identity can be called a Mahavakya. In the Upanishads, there are many. In the Bhagavad Gita, there are many. So there are, we speak of 4 Mahavakyas, which are taken from the Upanishads found in each of the 4 Vedas, because they are especially clear and especially powerful, but certainly not the only 4. So there are hundreds of Mahavakyas. So he says, Sareva tvamasi iti ukte, when the scripture says, tattvamasi, when the scripture says, you are Brahman, then what is the consequence? Atmanaha, for Atma, and here we have to say, for you, the individual. Here Atma cannot mean sat-chit-ananda. Let's see the statement. You see why I'm backing off on that. For Atma, muktatam, liberation, the state of being mukta, liberated, muktatam na sthiram, is not firm. So when the scripture says you are Brahman, the liberation of Atma is not firm. I'm being very, very literal here, and hopefully that doesn't sound good. That's a problem with literal translations, because you know very well Atma doesn't get liberated. So therefore, Atma means what? Can't mean your true nature here, has to mean you, the individual, jiva. So, and then jiva, for the jiva, muktatam na sthiram, is not firm. Notice in our prior discussion, this is what, in fact, let me go back. This is important enough to see. Okay. Again, I have to push all these buttons. I have to push this one and this one. Okay. Notice that both Shankara and Mandana are in agreement on this point. That is, when, so, Sad-asi, what is that? I forget already. Sadeva tvamasi. So when the scripture tells you, iti ukte, when it is said by the scripture that you are Brahman, we're obviously speaking about Shravana, and in this case, then he says that Atmanaha, for you, the individual, muktatam, liberation, is na sthiram. That literally means not firm, but it's vague, maybe intentionally vague, so that it can apply both ways. So na sthiram, not firm, how about if we just modify it a little bit? Not complete. Not firm, not complete. For Shankara, it's not complete because there are pratibandhas that need to be removed. Doubts and habitual identification. For Mandana, it's not complete because it's only indirect knowledge at this point, paroksha jnanam, and it remains to be converted into aparoksha jnanam. So that knowledge that you get from the scripture, na sthiram, is not complete. Okay. Then, how to make it complete? And here is where, remember this is Purva Paksha now. So here we're going to get Mandana's directions on how to make it complete. And he says, look, start in the third line. Ataha, therefore, yukti anuchintayet. Anuchintayet, you should think about yukti, reasoning. He's referring to manana here, right? What is manana? It's the use of yukti to remove doubts. Manana. So, and here, they're both in agreement. Both Shankara and Mandana both acknowledge the importance, the necessity of manana for the sake of removing doubt. So, yukti anuchintayet, you should perform manana, and not just manana. In the third line, prapadyate, there should be the practice of what? Prasanchaksham, which means the same as prasankyana. Chaksh often means to see, but it also means to say. So samprachaksh, to say again and again. In what sense? Aham brahmasmi, aham brahmasmi, aham brahmasmi. So here he is proposing that since, this is Mandana's teaching, since Shravana only gives, since Shravana is not complete, nastaram, since Shravana does not in and of itself give you everything you want. And that's very casual, but it's very correct. Because you don't want, if you had a choice of having jnanam or jnana phala, right? So jnana is not enough. Jnana phala. So therefore, incomplete. And so he says you have to do manana, and you have to do this prasankyana, here called prasanchaksham. Now, let's examine that a little bit. Suppose you're studying physics. You understand what is energy, you understand what is mass, and you understand what is the speed of light. And your teacher gives you Einstein's famous formula, E equals mc squared. So suppose you start repeating E equals mc squared, E equals mc squared, E equals mc squared. That is an accurate comparison. Aham brahmasmi, aham brahmasmi, aham brahmasmi. E equals mc squared, E equals mc squared, E equals mc. How is a repetition going to, before you begin the repetition of E equals mc squared, either you understand the consequences of that equation or you don't. Is repeating that equation going to change anything? It'll give you a headache. That's pretty much the only change that will take place. Now, there's a technical reason for this and two very important things. But by the way, Shankara is going to do the refutation in his own words in a few verses. But I think for our sakes, as we're going through the Purva Paksha, I think it's important to do the refutation as we go along. That is, instead of to do 4 verses of refutation and then 4 verses of 4 verses of, what did I say? 4 verses of Purva Paksha followed by, so instead of doing all these 4 verses of Purva Paksha, I think it's important to do the refutation as we go along, and then we'll see Shankara's teachings. So the refutation is twofold. We're after aparoksha jnanam. Or just simply put jnanam, knowledge. Leave aparoksha, leave that aside. The goal is to gain jnanam. How do you gain jnanam? Well, every philosophy and teaching tradition says you need a means of knowledge. So to gain knowledge of my presence here on the chair, you require a pramana called eyesight. To hear my words, you require a pramana called hearing. So we have our 5 senses backed up with the mind, and that is a pramana for gaining knowledge about the physical world around us. So senses are a pramana. Then we extend those senses when you see, so here's a pramana, when you see smoke arising from a mountainside, you gain knowledge of fire. How? We call that inference. So inference is another pramana. Here it's interesting to point out that your sense perception, which we call pratyaksha pramana, we may have discussed this long ago. Let me just, for those of you who know the Sanskrit terms, let me use them. If you've never heard these Sanskrit terms before, don't get hung up. The concept is more important than the language here. So through sense perception, pratyaksha pramana, do you get direct knowledge, aparoksha jnanam, or do you get indirect knowledge, paroksha jnanam? So you see me sitting here. Is that direct knowledge or indirect? We call that direct knowledge. You see me. Of course, there's a lot of complexity there that we'll conveniently overlook, but it's considered direct knowledge. Now, when you see the smoke rising above the mountain, your knowledge of smoke is paroksha or aparoksha? It's direct, aparoksha. By the way, a little confusing, aparoksha, but so a little different from the English. So in the English, we negate direct. And in Sanskrit, you say not indirect. That's what it is. Aparoksha, not indirect. Did a grammar teacher ever tell you not to use double negatives? In Sanskrit, there's no such rule. Double negatives are frequently used in Sanskrit. So aparoksha, not indirect. So you see the excuse me. So you see the smoke directly, and then you infer the presence of fire. That inferred fire, is that knowledge or not? You can't say there's no fire. You see the smoke. When you see the smoke, and it's clearly smoke of a fire, you can't say there is no fire on the mountain, so you gain knowledge. But is that knowledge paroksha, indirect, or paroksha, aparoksha, direct knowledge? It is clearly paroksha jnanam, indirect knowledge. It's still knowledge, but it is indirect knowledge. Okay, so here's the problem. We also use words. Words are also pramana. When I describe to you the presence of a waterfall at the foot of the town of Gangotri, it is 12,000 feet up in the Himalayas, do you gain knowledge from that? Yeah. Is it direct or indirect? In that case, it is indirect. But it's still knowledge, because words can be a pramana. So here we have three kinds of pramana. Pratyaksha pramana, sense perception, gives knowledge. We have anumana pramana, gives knowledge. And we have shabda, shabda means words. Shabda pramana gives knowledge. Something that's not a pramana doesn't give knowledge. Tell me, will the practice, what a silly example. Suppose you do some push-ups, exercise. Will that give you knowledge? It's silly, right? It's a function, it's a practice, but it is not a pramana. Now here's the first key issue. Repetition of a statement is repetition of pramana. Suppose you only partially understand what E equals mc squared. We'll chanting it again and again, E equals mc squared. We should set that to some raga. Chanted like we do in meditation. Will that give you complete knowledge? If you start off with incomplete knowledge, E equals mc squared, will the repetition of E equals mc squared give you complete knowledge? The point here is repetition is not a pramana. So this is our first refutation. There are more to come. This is our first refutation of Mandana Mishra's doctrine of prasankhya. Repetition is not a pramana, is not a valid means of knowledge. Again, I want to make sure that's clear to you. If you have incomplete knowledge about E equals mc squared, its repetition is not going to complete your knowledge. If you have incomplete knowledge of aham brahmasmi, repetition is not going to give you complete knowledge, because repetition is not a pramana. What is repetition? If I go on saying aham brahmasmi, or if I do it mentally, aham brahmasmi. If I say it out loud, aham brahmasmi, that's called vachika karma. It's karma, an action I'm doing with my voice. Vachika karma. If I recite it mentally, aham brahmasmi, it's then manasa karma. It's a karma, right? Does karma give knowledge? What about my example of doing push-ups? Silly, right? Karma will not give knowledge. Further, and this is a connection to something we've studied before, but you may not see this coming. I don't think you'll see this coming. Look at this. The knowledge we are seeking is not an ordinary knowledge. It is a transcendent knowledge, knowledge of the absolute, knowledge of Brahman. Tell me, we've been through this before, enlightenment, that's the consequence of this knowledge. Enlightenment is a state of perfection. It's a state of perfect freedom from sadness. It's a state that we call an I'm not getting the right words here. We could say it is if we call enlightenment an achievement, would you call that achievement a small achievement, a big achievement, or an off-the-chart achievement? Now you're remembering our discussion before. And it's an off-the-chart achievement. Now I'll come back to karma. For a small effort, you get a small result. For a big effort, if you want a big result, you require a big effort. And if you want an off-the-chart, an infinite result, how about if we call the result immortality, as many texts do? If the result is immortality that we seek, if it's an absolute result, if it's an off-the-chart result, how much karma would be required? Infinite karma. For an infinite result, infinite karma. So, if prasankhana as a karma is being performed to lead to moksha, and moksha we understand as an infinite result, about a vast result, how many times do you think you should recite Aham Brahmasmi? And how long will it take you to do that? So here's another defect in Mandana Mishra's thinking. So first of all, repetition is not a pramana. Repetition is a karma. So no karma can give you knowledge. Problem one. Problem two, karmas only give limited results. We're not looking for a slight improvement in the quality of our lives. We're seeking enlightenment. How much, if enlightenment is a product of effort, how much effort would that require? Infinite effort. So if that enlightenment, if that moksha is a result of repetition, how much repetition should be done? Okay. This is a good place to stop. We're just getting started. Although this is like the most, I can't even say it's not. The most important will come in our next class. I can't even say this is most important. But I want to, before we conclude, ask you to reflect on the thoroughness of this teaching. I am just in awe. This is Shankara. Everything that I'm not using Shankara's words. We'll see Shankara's words in the future. But everything I'm teaching you right now, everything I'm telling you is based on Shankara's insights. How thorough, how precise. And for me, this is so crucial in these teachings because it's natural to doubt, will teachings stand the test of time? There are many scientific discoveries that didn't stand the test of time. For example, 150 years ago, they had this concept of elan vital. There was some power of life. They thought mere chemicals couldn't be alive. But we're all composed of what? Chemicals. So how can mere chemicals become alive? So 100, 200 years ago, they posited some kind, elan vital, a little bit similar to our concept of prana. Not exactly the same, but similar. So did that teaching stand the test of time? No. Proved to be defective. And what I'd like you to appreciate here is, look how thorough this teaching is. Shankara lived at least 1,200 years ago. Has it stood the test of time? Absolutely, because of this thoroughness, which means in another 1,200 years, no one can refute this. It's that carefully thought out. So there's no refutations coming. On the other hand, Shankara very handily refutes Mandana Mishra. There's more of that refutation to come, and we'll see that in next week's class. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat.